Greetings, I'm Ed Steinfeld, Director of the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. Welcome to our special event, Pandemic Preparedness, Myth or Reality, a conversation with Governor and former Secretary of Health and Human Services, Mike Leavitt, and Watson Senior Fellow and former Republican National Committee Chair, Michael Steele. This event is part of Watson's Class of 2020 Speaker Series, which connects absolutely distinguished public servants and thought leaders with our own students here at Brown in the lead up to degree conferral this coming weekend. Congratulations to all of our graduating seniors. You made it. You made it with flying colors and at a very challenging time. I'm so proud of you all. I'm going to provide very brief introductions of our guests in just a moment, but let me say a bit about how this is going to work over the next hour or so. In a moment, Michael Steele and Governor Leavitt and I will have a conversation for about half an hour or so, but then we're going to take questions from all of you in the audience. For those of you who are connecting via Zoom, you can ask questions via the Q&A box, and you could start populating that Q&A box with questions right now and keep on doing so while our guests and I are speaking. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube Live, you can also submit questions there, and I'll pass those on to the panel. I especially want to encourage students from the class of 2020 to ask questions, really, and for any students, please do us a favor and mention your class year when you ask a question. So again, don't wait for the conversation to end before asking. You can go ahead and start asking questions right now. And now for some very brief bios of our guests. Governor Mike Leavitt, among his many career accomplishments, served as Secretary of Health and Human Services during the second term of President George W. Bush's administration. As Secretary, Governor Leavitt administered a $750 billion budget, that's almost 25% of the federal budget, and led an agency of 67,000 employees. Governor Leavitt, as Secretary, implemented the Medicare Part D prescription drug program, which, as I'm sure you know, is critical today, especially for our senior citizens. International collaboration was also a very important part of Governor Leavitt's tenure at HHS. And in fact, the Chinese government, in a different era from the current moment, awarded Governor Leavitt with the China Public Health Award. It's the first time that this award was ever given to a foreign government official. Prior to serving as HHS Secretary, Governor Leavitt served in the Bush administration as the administrator of the EPA. And of course, prior to his service in Washington, Governor Leavitt served 3 terms as the governor of the great state of Utah. Michael Steele, who's such an extraordinary member of our Watson faculty, many of you have gotten to know Michael and learn from Michael, as I have, of course. Michael has an equally extraordinary career of public service and thought leadership. Audiences all over the world now know Michael today for his political analysis and his journalism on MSNBC. Prior to that stage in his career, Michael served as chairman of the Republican National Committee from 2009 to 2011. And prior to that, Michael had served in elected office as Lieutenant Governor of Maryland and had also served as chairman of the Maryland Republican Party. Michael is the founding member of the Republican Leadership Council. So, gentlemen, I'm just going to begin with some questions, and then we'll let the conversation go wherever you'd like. Maybe, Governor Leavitt, if I could just ask you a bit of a historical question, recent history. When you were Secretary of HHS, can you give me a sense of what pandemic preparedness looked like at that time? What were the challenges you faced, and what were some of the solutions you tried to implement?
So a brief story. I had been Secretary of Health for probably 3 or 4 months, and I had placed on my schedule an emergency briefing from the Center for Disease Control. I received the briefing, and it was about a virus they were concerned about. The H5N1 was an avian influenza that had, according to them, pandemic potential. Pandemic potential meant that it had been able to transmit itself, the virus, from birds into people. And what alarmed them was that 60% of the people who received this virus died. And there was worry that the virus could then mutate enough that it could be actually going from person to person. And that's when a virus goes from having potential to actually being a pandemic virus. And of course, we've all experienced that now as we've seen the coronavirus achieve rapid transmission person to person and become a global pandemic. Well, that actually was my introduction to the world of pandemics. And the next day I had a conversation with a colleague of mine who pointed out there's some things I needed to learn about pandemics and gave me a couple of books, and I read them, and I was just overwhelmed by the sense of gravity that this part of biologic history has, and how unusual it seemed to me that I had lived a pretty full life and a fairly sophisticated life, and I didn't know much about pandemics. And I began to read these books, and I began to study, and I began to realize these things happen. They happen with a fair regularity. We've had 3 of them at that point in 100 years. We had had 10 of them in 300 years, and when they happen, they change everything. And that was an academic exercise at that point. Now I have experienced it, as have you, and I have an entirely different view of pandemics. But at that point in time, it was clear the United States of America was not prepared, and we weren't alone. The world was not prepared. And we're also not alone as a generation, because one of the things about pandemics is that they come every 30 or so years, and when they do, the generation that's in charge didn't realize how big a threat this was, and they have let other priorities come in the way of this kind of preparation, and that's exactly where we were. So I went to the president and I said, look, we need to understand this, and the president read some of the same books I did, came to the conclusions that I did, authorized us to go to Congress. Congress appropriated a little over $7 billion, and I spent the next 3.5 years out talking with states and with businesses and with civil society, with education and universities, saying we have to be prepared because there will be a pandemic. Now, I will tell you the thing I learned from that is that anything you say in advance of a pandemic seems alarmist. Anything that you do before it happens or after it happens is inadequate, and that's where we are. We've now seen both parts of this. I've seen this sounds alarmist, and I'm now seeing anything you do is inadequate. This is a tough thing that the world has to face.
You know, I completely agree with you. I mean, speaking personally, in the past, when colleagues have talked about the risk of pandemics, I sort of rolled my eyes, low probability event. And so I'm guilty of that as well. So when you were secretary and you were talking to governors and local officials and business people, what kinds of issues were you raising with them, and what was the response like from people really in positions of expertise?
I'll tell you, my primary message was two of them. One is, look, pandemics happen. This is biologic fact. You may not have experienced it, but in the context of history, these things happen, and you have to be prepared. And the second thing I said to them was, and by the way, it's a very unique kind of an emergency. And if you think you can expect the federal government to ride to your rescue, you're going to be tragically disappointed, because not because the federal government lacks a will or it lacks a wallet to do it, but it's so unique because it's happening everywhere at the same time. And you need to start thinking about this and being ready. And that was the primary message.
Yeah. On the international front, what was it like, in those years? You were secretary not so long after SARS had happened, a few years after. What was it like interacting with colleagues in China? What was the nature of transparency or lack of transparency? How did that work?
Well, transparency has always been an issue, and not just with the Chinese. A big part of the way we spent some of that $7 billion is building a network of laboratories around the world, because more times than not, the viruses will come from someplace other than the United States. Now, there's, by the way, always controversy about where they started, because nobody wants that label. But the truth is they start somewhere, and the faster you can get them and have relationships with other countries. And the better off everyone is, because you can start on the track to a vaccine more quickly. So I spent time in Asia, I spent time in Europe, I spent time in Central and South America, spending U.S. money to build relationships where we could create laboratories that were sophisticated enough that when a pandemic virus emerged, we could get it quickly. And so there's a huge degree of international policy and foreign policy that goes into this. That's just one part. Another part is vaccines. Who gets vaccines first? If there's a vaccine and they're manufactured in various places, how do you afford? Lots and lots of issues, some of which we've faced, some of which we haven't yet.
To what extent do you think that those investments haven't been kept up, and I don't mean that in a particularly political or American sense, but the infrastructure that you saw either in place or evolving internationally, how is it done in intervening years after you were no longer secretary?
Well, I think there's a kind of pattern here that you can see over history, where people will get sort of wound up on it and they'll start investing in it, and then over time other things become a priority. And as you said, kind of low probability investment. I think maybe we can invest in this for now and we'll worry about that next year. And that happened all over the world. It's human nature. And the result of that was, I think you go in sort of preparation cycles. And I think things are better as a result of what we did, but I don't think everything we put in place has stayed in place. And I think some of that can be seen even in vaccine manufacturing. We spent almost $2.5 billion in creating unique vaccine manufacturing capability inside the United States. And I think when we do get a vaccine, how it's going to be manufactured is still going to be an issue.
Yeah, I want to circle back to some of those policy issues in just a moment, but I'd really like to hear from you both about your assessment of the American political response. And I mean that on both sides of the aisle, all sides of the aisle. But how do you assess how American society in a political manner has responded to the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Michael, you want to take that one first, or you want me to jump in?
I'll lead off on this one. I think in large measure, the realities of what Mike has described and kind of put in context, going back to the Bush administration, and we can even go further back than that, is there are two realities that try to coexist and oftentimes have a hard time doing so, and that is the reality of the disease, the virus, the epidemic, the medical crisis in the context of something like coronavirus or SARS or some other illness, and the political reality of, the politics, the money, the response. And what we've seen, from the secretary going to the president and saying, I think we may have a problem here and we need to try to figure out how to get ahead of it, to the presidential response, which then filters into all the agencies of government from, CDC, Department of Health, et cetera, all the way down to the states, in sort of galvanizing response to that crisis. And then the political noise that kind of spins around it, that sort of colors and shapes and forms how that response is actually put in front of the public, how the public responds to that. All of these things have, I think, fed the beast that has made what we see now in terms of a political response inadequate. In other words, the politics tends to dominate the science. And that's not a position you want to be in. And I think the secretary could tell you, and Mike's in an interesting spot because he was both secretary and governor. Mm-hmm. So he can speak to the realities, both political and scientific, from having to manage it as a secretary on behalf of an administration, and also what a governor has to go through, which is what we've seen play out across the country in the last 4 months, how governors have kind of been forced into a spot that, to one of the governor's earlier points, they weren't expected to play that role there. They thought the federal government would at least come down with some guideposts on how to begin to manage and maneuver through this. I mean, from everything from the Defense Production Act, executing on that, which would then put production here in the United States in motion to get out into the public, into the states, the very things that they need, as well as, the stockpile of what we already had, which, that became a political debate on whether or not the stockpile was there for the governors to access, or if it was wholly owned by the federal government to do with as they saw fit. And so what we've seen now, just in the 10, 15, 20 years between the Bush administration and now, is a much more elevated political drive on something like this versus a scientific one. And that, to me, does not speak well for the future if we don't get it right now. We don't turn that corner on this now and recognize that politics, while, yeah, it's going to be there, you can't take politics out of things as easily as some people may think. It can't be the driver. We have to listen to scientists. We have to listen to the medical professionals, CDC, WHO, Department of Health, military, even our national security agencies who have their fingers on that pulse globally. Those are valuable assets, and that any administration, not just the Trump administration, but any future administration, is going to have to let that be the tip of the spear, and not so much the political response and having that drive the consequences of this. Because as we see, when you start off with a political response, you fall into the trap of, oh, this isn't as serious, it's not a big deal, it's a hoax, it doesn't matter, the other side is trying to use this against me. If that is your lead-off narrative, you wind up where we are today, playing catch up, and that is a very dangerous spot for the American people.
Governor Leavitt?
Well, one of the things that I learned back in the day when I was in charge of pandemic planning is that there has never been a serious pandemic that didn't completely shift economics, that didn't jigger politics, that didn't have a huge impact on sociology. These things turn the world upside down. And we're already beginning to see that. So you ask, when you start thinking about the politics, why? Well, first of all, politics is driven to a large extent by different people in different circumstances, different people with different priorities, people with different risk tolerance, and then money and power. You put all of those into the same moment and mix it with the potential of life and death, and you now have a kind of existential moment, and you're going to see big change. And we're just starting to see the political change. There's domestic politics. Listen, there won't be a nation on the earth that doesn't have some kind of domestic challenge politically as a result of this, despite their form of government. We talked a little bit about the Chinese. Look, the Chinese are going to have their version of this, and they're having it. They'll respond to it differently. In the United States, we're going to see it dramatically impact the effect. I think it will define the outcome of the 2020 election. We don't know exactly how it will define it, but it clearly is going to be right at the debate. And so I don't think there's anything ought to be surprised about. It's nothing that's unique. This is what happens in pandemics.
Ed, can I jump in for a second? I want to follow up on that point, if I could, with Governor
Please
Leavitt.
do.
So, in light of that, and given that every government is going to be transformed by this and is being transformed by this, how is this pandemic different from the ones that have come before in terms of that response, that post-pandemic response, number one? And number two, do you think that this creates a moment where globally we can coalesce and create something akin to a global response network to such pandemics in the future, where there's better coordination, communication, better alignment of resources, where your dollars in Europe and our dollars here in the US and their dollars on the African continent, and certainly in Asia, all of that can then be utilized and galvanized in a way to affect a better global response. How do you see those two pieces coming together potentially to get ahead of something like this in the future?
So I divide that into a couple of portions. Let's talk about the things that are different with this one. And let's start with something that's not different, and that's human nature. Human nature has not dramatically changed since the pandemic of 1918. And hence, we're all energized and anxious, and we have our own, the whole idea of priorities being different, risk tolerance being different, all of that's different, or as the same. However, what has changed is communication and the fact that it's a small world in terms of our ability to communicate. If there's ever been a generation that should be in a position to cope with this well, it would be the current generation, given the tools we have. The fact that we in 1918, actually our government was not talking about this a lot because we were in the midst of economic and foreign and war conditions when we didn't want to signal that we were in trouble. And so a lot of people were affected by the lack of information. Now we have this almost overabundance of information where we've all become pandemic experts. Mm-hmm. And in some ways that makes it easier, and in some ways it makes it hard. But I think in the final analysis, it isn't the technical tools that would limit that. It's not technology that limits it, it's sociology that limits it. And I would have to say that we'll come out of this experience better ready, but when some time has passed, a lot of that same human nature that made us unprepared will start to kick in again, and you'd think we'd be smarter this time as a generation, but there's not been a generation up to this point that's been able to carry that preparation out for 10 or 15 or 20 years. Now, I will say this. Preparation for a pandemic isn't so different from preparation for a lot of other emergencies. And so as a country, we should be able to be much better prepared. In terms of being able to have a world that's better prepared, that's pretty complicated.
Governor Leavitt, can I ask, you mentioned that we're really only at the beginning of the pandemic. And so we see states opening up all across the country. Of course, it's slightly, different rates. States have been affected differently, but things are opening. What's your sense of what may or what's likely to happen, say, in the fall? And what does pandemic response look like at that point?
So let's just acknowledge for a minute that social distancing, what we've been through, was a pretty dramatic response. And it was in reality a medical intervention. Now, put it into that context for a second. We've all had a friend, or maybe even personally had the situation where you had a really painful ailment. And a medical intervention was provided, which is medication to help you with the pain. And when they gave you that medical intervention, the pain medication, they said, now look, there's some dangers here. If you use too much of this, there's going to be side effects. If you use this for too long, there could be side effects. And so we have to be careful on how we apply this medical intervention because of the side effects. Well, we have learned that the side effects of social distancing and lockdown and all of those other things that we've done are having the same kind of sort of civic or national side effects. Our economy is really damaged by this. Our sociology is changing. People are anxious. It's having side effects. And here's the point. The virus hasn't gone away, but our capacity to apply this medical innovation of social distancing has been affected by the fact that we're having all these side effects. And there's a point where the side effects are worse than the disease. Now, is it going to be part of the difficulty is it's not the same everywhere? And I like to say this is a time when we have to rebalance ourselves. We have to titrate the way we're applying this social distancing intervention. Now, how's it going to play out? Well, we now have it worked. The medical intervention we applied worked, and we in most cases now have the virus at least transmitting around break even or sometimes under 1. But we know the virus is probably going to start picking up as a result. And so we're going to have to learn then to apply a little bit of the medical intervention and just try to balance this. So this is a period where we're going to be balancing and learning how to titrate the tools that are available to us. And you ask me how it's going to go, I don't know. I think we're going to be learning a lot as we go.
You know, it's felt so acutely in academia because in a way universities, they have aspects of being almost like cruise ships with residential education where we'll be bringing, if possible, students from many different parts of the United States and many different parts of the world. And I know there are many industries, many parts of the country that have that challenge when you get a lot of mixing of people. And I guess as we get toward the end of our conversation, I want to remind the audience to ask questions. But as we near the end of our conversation, I guess I want to ask both technically, what does the response have to look like as we start intermingling again and shifting across geographies, but also politically, presumably there are going to be some big bumps in the road moving forward. Is our political system capable of dealing with the kind of disruption that we're facing? And I don't mean that in terms of revolution, but is the current two-party system, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, is that distinction of politics suitable for dealing with a kind of social and political and economic pressures that are going to be bearing down on us likely in the next few months?
Are you directing that to me?
Sure, Governor Leavitt, why don't you start?
Okay.
But Michael, of course, we want to hear your opinion too.
Well, I'll use an analogy. While I was in the government, I went on wasn't top secret, but it was very carefully protected information. I went into an area of Pakistan that was experiencing a lot of terrorism. And everywhere I traveled, I had to have armored stuff on, and I mean, and even in the car, it's just like you're waiting for a terrorist, a bomb to go off at any second, and it was an anxious feeling. It kind of reminds me of this situation. And I remember saying to one of the leaders there, "How do you live with this? How do you live with the fact that you could have a bomb go off in any market at any time? That you could have someone with an explosive suit on disrupt? How do you live with that?" He said, "It's interesting how we all begin to settle on and how we manage risk in our life. And at some point in time, you start to realize that this is the risk I'm now dealing with. And there are some things I can do to alter that, and you become accustomed to it, and you begin to manage it." And I think that's where we're going to end up a year from now. If we have a vaccine, that'll be great and so forth. That's a different conversation. But I think the likelihood is that this this virus is going to be with us for quite a while, and that we're going to learn how to manage this risk. I don't think we can lock down again the way we did before. I think we're just going to have to deal with flare-ups that'll happen, and they'll be, we'll hear about it. There's a flare-up in X, Y, or Z country. There's a hot spot here, and we'll see. So that's too bad. We're sorry about that, but we'll avoid that area, and we're going to do. I think we're going to learn to manage through this with tools, and that's why I keep saying this is a time to rebalance and a time to learn, because we're going to learn.
Yeah, I guess I was saying, Michael, at the around the time of the last epidemic, 1918, I mean, we had the progressive era, huge change in American politics from the Gilded Age. Do you foresee a huge transformation like that?
Not so much. I think that there are other variables that are at play here. There intra and inter-party battles that are going to get played out over the course of the next few months. And then, of course, there's the election itself, which will have an enormous reshaping effect one way or the other, regardless of whether the incumbent president wins or loses. There's going to be a reshaping, I think, to Governor Leavitt's point about the management of this going forward. I think a big part of the management relative to the politics is going to require our political leadership to think differently about the problem and not see it the way they currently do. And that is more of a reactive response as opposed to a proactive one. There is, in my estimation, no clear delineated way forward. It is still very much reactionary. Governors are taking upon themselves to deal in the moment and to get maybe 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks out in some responses and in some ways. But even there, it's limited at this point because you still have to rely on your federal partner to be in the same space you are. So I think there's going to have to be, in terms of managing this going forward, our government leaders are going to have to think about it differently and to be more creative in their responses. They're going to have to look around the globe to see what was working and what did work and what was successful. As the governor noted, their flare-ups, how do we deal with this? Now, one of the things that when I had Governor Leavitt on my podcast that he raised, which I thought was a phenomenally smart and incredibly important future approach, planning, sort of dealing with this real time, was putting in an alert system that's akin to what we have now post 9/11 for terrorist threats. And so I think that for me speaks to a level of thinking and planning to manage this going forward that our government officials have to really begin to take into account. And Governor, if you get a moment to talk about your work in this space and sort of creating this sort of, pandemic alert system or health alert system, I think that's the kind of thinking that's going to make a difference for citizens in their management of this going forward, irrespective of what the government does. That there are some foundational bricks that can be put in place, I think, longer term, that will mitigate against the current political climate, which tends to be more reactive instead of responsive.
In fact, Michael, on that point, we have a great question from the audience. Christopher Garrity asks, what are some important opportunities that, in your opinion, are being overlooked right now, but really should be utilized by people or local government? So maybe Governor Leavitt, you could talk about the alert system.
Well, as Michael pointed out, we have a lot of different kinds of alert systems, which are actually risk frameworks. What is the risk on during a given period? Is it low or is it high? And we've seen those kind of risk stratification frameworks beginning to emerge in this crisis. But in terrorism, they have a color-coded system, and the colors go from light to dark, and the darker they are, the more difficult it is. So what Michael's referencing is that I've worked with a lot of states recently who are beginning to stratify risk by saying red is the most acute, orange is low, yellow orange is moderate, yellow is low, and green is about normal. The risk is dissipated. And then you use that stratified risk. And let's just take a college or a university campus, for example. There are certain risks that occur on a campus because it's like a little community. And if you were to say, how do we manage gatherings? Well, under red or high risk, you probably wouldn't have any gatherings. If you were under orange, you might say you could have gatherings that are up to 8 people, but let's keep people at least at 6 feet and wear masks. If you're at yellow, you might expand the size of it. Well, if you're managing a college campus, and then what you have to first do is figure out what is the risk profile of the period we're in. It's yellow. Oh, well, we can have groups up to 50. And in a classroom, here's what we know about the virus. Here are the ways that we can manage this. Maybe there's some classes we don't want to have. For example, we know that the virus is spread with droplets, and that one of the ways that you have droplets passed is through respiratory activity. So what are the high respiratory activities? Well, surprisingly, there's athletics, but there's also choir. Mm-hmm. You sing in a choir, you're at risk because there's a lot of droplets coming. So we begin to put things into a framework and begin to manage the risks. I hope that's descriptive enough, but it's a system. It's a systematic way of being able to know the risk at a time, know the activity, and know the ways in which you can mitigate it. And once you have that, you can begin to operate in a much more normal way.
Is your sense, Governor Leavitt, that kind of system requires deep contact tracing and the kinds of things that maybe some citizens will recoil from in terms of privacy issues?
Well, I do think that they're quickly related. One of the major things that people need to know in order to stratify the risk, is it low or is it not, or is it high, is the origin of transmission. If we know where people got it and we can quarantine them, that's much better than if suddenly people are just showing up and we haven't any idea. It's coming from the community. Testing is the only way you can know that. So if you want to have this kind of a risk construct, you've got to have enough testing that you know the origin of the disease and how people are getting it.
Yeah. Michael, did you want to add something? You look like you were.
I think the governor put it in the correct perspective, and I think it's one of the tools with respect to management that is going to be essential on the other side of all of this. And again, my concern and my belief is that we really won't be able to your question, original question, we really won't be able to get into that level of specific and detail until after this upcoming election, unfortunately. But that's part of the reality. And I think between now and then, a lot of this, which we're already beginning to see play out, is citizens, everyday Joes and Janes are going to say, you know what, you opened up, but I'm not going to that restaurant this week. I'm not going to engage in this kind of activity. We are going to continue to self-separate and self-select when we want to go out into the public. So this is to the economic argument, a larger concern. Everybody's jumping, thinking, and it's unfortunate, they're putting out this idea that we're going to open up the economy and all of a sudden the cash is going to come flooding back into these businesses and employment numbers are going to start dropping and everybody's going to be, no, that's not how this is going to play out. Because restaurants aren't going to have full capacity. markets aren't going to have full capacity. We have pictures here in the Washington area at the farmers market where people are standing in line 6 feet apart, going down around the corner, around the block, and folks aren't going to do that. I'm not going to stand in the line for 2 hours to go pick up an onion. And so we've got to have context to all of this in pushing these things out there and moving forward. And what Governor Leavitt is talking about is managing that in a way that we don't add to the risk unnecessarily.
To Michael's point, I mean, if you're a political scientist right now, this is fascinating. And to a political science student, this is case study one. I mean, if you want to think about the politics of this, so Republicans tend to be more individualistic. Democrats tend to be more group-oriented. Republicans tend to think limited government. Democrats tend to think, no, we'll have government play a greater role. So you can begin to see, all of this play out. This is why it's such a politically complicated thing, and I agree with Michael. If you've got people who disagree about whether or not a group activity that benefits everybody is rational. Right. I don't want to be tested because they might have my personal information. Okay, I know I might get something out of that by being able to know the source of it, but it's not worth it to me. I'm using that hypothetically. Those are the debates that are going on, and it's the reason this is. We're really very we're very undecided in that way right now.
You're both speaking, I think, about providing people with reliable information and then letting people decide based on a variety of different political values, social values, which to me makes a lot of sense and sounds very rational. We have a question from the audience, though, about disinformation. And how does this rational approach also deal with potentially the reality of a flood of disinformation? Maybe some of that disinformation comes from political actors on various sides of the spectrum, but also just social media, the pandemic type videos, or the anti-vaxxer campaigns. How do you see that volume of information playing into the response over the coming months?
I would say, just out of the box, from my perspective, it is enormously harmful. It is life-threatening. It is obviously devastating to not just the individual who consumes this information and decides to go and act on it, or not act on it, depending on the information, but also to the broader community. So you have a number of folks, and God love them, they're still American citizens and they're part of the family, but they think, I'm not wearing a mask. I'm just going to go out and I'm going to go hang out in the park, and I'm going to go to the beach, and I'm going to go, and I'm not going to put the protective gear on. And somehow it's gotten into the ether, the information ether, that, well, wearing a mask is a sign of weakness. I had a friend of mine say to me yesterday, she was out and was wearing a mask, and a woman came up to her who wasn't wearing a mask and started berating her for wearing a mask. And of course, my friend looked at her and said, between the two of us, I'm not the stupid one. And so this is the new space that we're in, where the information is pushed out, and because maybe we're all sort of on lockdown and have been on lockdown for 2 months, it's like, oh, okay, anything to help me get outside, I'm going to do it. It was, I say, just go stand on your front porch, take a drink with you, yell at your neighbor, and come back in the house. I mean, this is not a complicated process. We don't know what we don't still know about this virus. There's scientists telling us it's mutating. So this information is important. And yeah, I'm going to go there. The reality of it is, in past, when you looked at a President Obama, and you look at a President Bush, and you even go back to a President Clinton, they asserted presidential leadership in a way in which, instead of hyperventilating the public and exercising the wrong passions. They spoke with clarity, distinction, and direction, calming those passions, giving things perspective, trusting the smart people like a secretary of the agency in charge, having a Secretary Leavitt go out and do what needs to be done, and then making sure that the government response was consistent. Now, the difference between then and now is social media. And the fact that we allow social media to corrupt our process of thinking and internalizing and forming ourselves is a responsibility we have to take. When you have someone tell you that injecting yourself with detergent will kill the virus, they're absolutely right. It will kill the virus and it will kill you. But you've got to discern that, yeah, the rest of that is I die too. And that is a big part of the breakdown, where we sort of taking at face value this information because the authority putting it out there is an authority. Well, the brain doesn't shut down just because the President of the United States says something. You also have to critically think through whether or not this is the rational best thing for you at the moment. And like that young woman who was criticizing my friend for wearing a mask, understand where stupid is, and it shouldn't be with you.
Yes, Governor Leavitt.
I was just going to add that this is sort of a 50,000-foot observation. We've been talking about politics. Politics and political competition doesn't just exist between parties. It also exists between forms of government. There are forms of government in this world that don't trust individuals to this kind of behavior. And they can say lock down, and they lock down. They enforce it with government, and I rebel at the thought of that. But there are governments that are doing it, and there are economies that are being driven by those that are that are become dominant powers. The United States is a democracy where we believe in individual liberty. But what makes a democracy work is the aggregate heart of the people. And if any point in time the aggregate heart of that people are unable to move forward in a thoughtful, responsible, effective way, it's not just those people that suffer, it's that form of government that ultimately is diminished. And we are in a very high level competition in the world that's economic and political. And the question will become, will a government made up based on individual liberty and innovation and capitalism, will it prevail in this crisis over one that uses a form of government we reject? And this social media thing is all part of it. It's about us. How are we going to behave, and are we able to claim the rightful title of a powerful influence on the world by our aggregate behavior? Now, that's 50,000 feet, but when you look at this as a political scientist, you have to be asking that question.
It's a really important point. And Governor Leavitt, it links to a question that a viewer on YouTube Live asks about the gap between arguably what American citizens think the federal government should be doing and what the federal government actually is doing. And it reminds me a little bit of issues of trust between citizens and government and vice versa. I think one could say that some democracies, South Korea, Taiwan, have responded pretty well to the threat, and they've done so in a way that reflected a kind of a trust between the citizenry and the government. I wonder whether you both think that there might be some kind of resurgence of trust, if not at the federal level, at the state level between citizens and governors. And across both parties, we've seen really some exemplary, I think, performance by governors in building trust and acting effectively with respect to citizens.
Well, I'll just say I think this has been a very good time for federalism. That is to say, federalism has lost a lot of its people's understanding of it, number one, or number two, the beauty of it and its wisdom. And I think the fact that governors have stepped up and are acting in both parties, are acting on the interests of their citizens, has begun to build more confidence in the state government and in local governments. There's been more confidence in state and local governments for a long time than there have been the federal government, but I think this has added to that.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think that's exactly right, and I think people are beginning to realize exactly how federalism plays itself out. Why something as innocuous and really not that well understood as the 10th Amendment actually now, oh yeah, I get it. You know, it kind of makes sense, and a lot of that has been driven by the fact that governors have had to step into this space in a way that we've not seen before. I think also, given the magnitude of this in the past, there were parts and sections of the country that may or may not have been affected. So their role and their response was, you know, if you need us, let us know. But now there is much more of a collective understanding of how this is playing out. And we saw it. We saw it land on the West Coast and come across the country. And everyone was kind of bracing for what that impact would be and how it would be felt, and what the response would be. And governors, all the way down to mayors in the smallest of municipalities, working with their city councils, working with their state legislatures, began to really put into motion strategies that people would go to them first for. And I think that was one of the more interesting responses that was exemplified by what you saw Governor Hogan, who's the head of the National Governors Association, and certainly our governor here in Maryland, Governor Cuomo, Governor Whitmer, Michigan, elsewhere, began to create these sort of leading narratives that other states and other communities began to rely on as well. So it became much more connected than we may have seen in the past. And I think that was a very important dynamic. And it'll be, again, going to that narrative that Governor Leavitt laid out before about managing all of this. That's going to be an essential part of that management system, as he indicated in the profile of the states that he's working with, to create this sort of response or alert level. That's going to require that form of communication and relationship that was born out of this crisis.
We just have a few minutes left, so I want to make sure we get to as many questions as possible from the audience. Rodon Shu has a question about how do HHS and CDC's roles differ in pandemic preparedness? And Governor Leavitt, you could talk about it under your tenure as secretary.
First, HHS is a department of government, and part of that department of government is the Centers for Disease Control. So they're really the same organization. CDC is simply a part of HHS. So the head of CDC, the director of CDC, reports to HHS, and their job is to oversee many different aspects of this pandemic response. In the National Institutes of Health, for example, where Dr. Fauci works, that is also part of HHS. So you take Dr. Fauci and NIH, and you take Dr. Redburn, who is at CDC. They both report to, if you will, Alex Azar, who is the Secretary of Health. Now, they have chosen to make this a government-wide response, and I think wisely, because transportation has a role, education has a role, labor has a role, Treasury has a role, and so having Vice President Pence as head of the task force makes some sense.
On the subject of federal versus state and some of the federalism issues, I think you both spoke very compellingly about the role of governors I would think I hope this doesn't happen, but if there's a kind of a resurgence in the summer or the fall and the winter of COVID, presumably we'll see the PPE supply chains stressed again, and I hope not, but potentially states competing against one another for supplies, for ventilators. And how do you foresee the federal government stepping back in and maybe trying to help with that competition really for resources?
Well, the federal government has we talked about federalism. What makes federalism is that the federal government has some limited but supreme roles, and the states have all other responsibilities. That's the 10th Amendment versus the constitutional concept of a limited supreme federal government. Under a limited form of government that we have, the federal government has some roles that only they can play, and it just is illustrated brilliantly in a pandemic. For example, vaccine. No state can do that. It has to be the federal government oversee that. Management of the economy. No state can do that. And so the federal government needs to step up with stimulus bills, with the Federal Reserve. No state can do that. Management of information. No state's in a position to get situational awareness that comes from collecting data from 30 or 50 different states and aggregating it into a map that gives us situational awareness. That's the kind of thing that the CDC can do. Supplementing public health. Again, public health is a local government response. It's where the tools are. It's where the people are. It's where the boots on the ground reside. But sometimes they just get overwhelmed, and so the federal government can supplement those by giving them money. That's all happening. So what I'm saying is there are things that only the federal government can do, and the federal government has to do them and do them well. Then there are things that the federal government can't do because it can't be everywhere at once. It just doesn't have the people. It doesn't have the tools, and we're seeing that play out. What we're talking about is federalism in action, where you have a limited, supreme federal government, and then you have all other duties being conducted at the state level. People get this mixed up, and they expect that the federal government's going to somehow make it all good, make it all better, make it all go away. Can't happen because it's just not a logical possibility, not to mention the constitutional issues involved.
You know, as we think about this intersection of different levels of government, different agencies of government, and of course, all the constitutional rules and checks and balances, and then layer on top of that all of the political forces and social forces. I mean, I just want to finish with almost an impossible question, but I'm eager to hear your views 5 years from now, 10 years from now, as we look back at this period. How do you think that the historians will grade, in some sense, the response of American society or the resilience of American society? In a way, I'm asking you to assess how are we doing and what's our capacity broadly as a society to do better?
I'm happy to respond to that, but Michael takes all impossible questions first.
Yeah, that's why I was chairman. That's what we do. We take impossible questions. I'm sorry, you're not going to win that election. That's all right. Yeah, and then the candidate storms out of the office. So I think it's a two-part answer. I think historians will judge and really exemplify for future generations the resiliency of the American people, the humanity of the American people, the response of first responders and essential workers, and those men and women who risk their own lives for the greater care of not just the community they lived in, but the country as a whole. And I think that assessment will be one that's going to be consistent with how history has even, up to now, it has judged Americans in their response to crises. individuals, despite our neighbor or that crazy uncle who, has gone rogue or behaves in a different way or thinks about these things differently. I think to a point that the governor made earlier, that there is an aggregate response by the American people that speaks very broadly and very well of how we respond. I think historian assessment of government will be less friendly, particularly at the federal level, and particularly with respect to the early days of this, given what we know now, let alone what we will find out in future years, months and years about what we knew then at the beginning of this. And I think that is actually, for me, not surprising, because I think that's the way it always breaks down. Our government is a lagging indicator of where things are, and how the American people actually kind of push to the point about federalism, actually pushes the government to eventually get it right and respond the right way and do the right thing. And so I think we're going to see history judge this in that way, and sort of looking at the two roles that were played out here between the government, federal response, and the response of the American people as represented by their governors and their state legislatures and their mayors, who had to put boots on the ground, get in front of this thing, try to stem its flow and its impact, and did so in a way that was quintessentially American.
Governor Leavitt?
I break it into the same two buckets and grade it the same way. I don't think we should ever pass by without noticing the remarkable response of the American people to this. Look, we canceled seasons, we canceled weddings, funerals, we locked down for a couple of months, and we did it all essentially voluntarily because it was the right thing to do. This was an amazing moment. Yeah. When a sense of unity kind of blew across the country. Now, it can't, that kind of thing can't last forever. I commented earlier on the side effects of this, but the American people, they came to the effort ready to go, and it's worked. And you look at the numbers, it's worked. Now, we're going to move forward now with what we learned, and we're going to face likely a second wave. And we'll learn what we did in the first wave in the second. We'll have to manage it separately, and I think the American people will respond correctly. Government, it's hard to it's hard to mobilize response on things like this, and there have been parts of it that have been done reasonably well, there have been parts of it that have been disappointing, and there'll be lessons learned, and I predict that we, at all levels, will manage the second wave better than we did the first.
I certainly hope so. It's struck me in recent months, and I know I should have understood this earlier, but it struck me how the weight of bearing with the weight of dealing with the COVID crisis has been borne by so many people who often went unrecognized, whether it's the bus drivers or the elder care workers or the grocery store workers who we may have walked past months ago, but today we recognize the incredibly vital role they're all playing in all states in binding us together and keeping us going. Governor Leavitt and Michael Steele, I really want to thank you both from the bottom of my heart. I want to thank you for educating us, the Brown community, educating me personally and our broader audience, and thank you for your public service roles and your thought leadership roles. And what you're doing today really underscores for all of us the importance of service and commitment really to society to help us get through these very challenging times. Thank you.
Pleasure. And to the class of Brown class of 2020, it's all yours, baby.
To graduates everywhere at Brown, across the United States, congratulations. 3 cheers. Thanks.